Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from this side of nowhere, where I share stories with you about growing up in a place where there are more cows than people. Sounds fantastic, right? Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about our sponsors. We're sponsored today by the Copper Corner Cafe. The Copper Corner Cafe in Basin, Wyoming is open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Stop by and try any of their delicious menu items featuring homemade bread for all sandwiches and, of course, their famous pie for dessert. Breakfast is served all day, so come on in to the Copper Corner Cafe. We're also sponsored by the Wyoming Welcome Program. The folks at the Wyoming Welcome Program distribute baskets and brochures that deliver local advertisements to both newcomers to the Bighorn Basin and to restaurant goers in Cody and Powell. The baskets are distributed to new move-ins, and the brochures are placed on restaurant tables in both Cody and Powell. So if you're interested in getting your business name out there, go ahead and contact them at HALEYJ, that's Haley J, at WyomingWelcome.com. And now, the podcast. I must say, spring is in full fling in Northwestern Wyoming. We're just waiting for a snowstorm to break stuff up, but so far the farmers are getting out there, breaking up some ground. Track has begun. It's an exciting time in Northwestern Wyoming, and I heard a lot of birds singing the other day. So I'm excited. I'm ready to be done with winter and get on with some of the warmer months of the year. In a place where winter lasts so long, it's always good to have spring. And with spring comes the annual burn-off, which is what this podcast story is about. If you're not familiar with agriculture in Wyoming, then you're not familiar with the big spring burn-off when farmers burn off the dead weeds and things from ditches and their pastures. It's an annual event, and whenever there's fire, there's bound to be some excitement. So buckle in. This story is called Getting Out of Hand. Here goes. Every year, Northwestern Wyoming experiences a miracle. For 6 long months, and often longer, winter holds Wyoming in its icy grasp with seemingly no hope of escape. Roads close when winter storms dump snow and icy winds blow. Plummeting temperatures freeze the surface of lakes and rivers, and any animal who has the option available to them hides away in hibernation's escape. To any onlooker who peers out at the dreary landscape while shivering with a quilt drawn around their shoulders, it may appear that Wyoming can never recover. Few places on earth can compete with the intensity, the unpredictability, and the length of a Wyoming winter. Many a Californian has moved to the equality state in the dog days of summer when realtors hawk breathtaking mountain views and your own piece of the West, only to be driven away by a September snowstorm. If a newcomer to Wyoming makes it through their second winter, then they have a much higher chance of staying. They seldom make it to January. That being said, for those who can tough out the months of ice and snow, there is a rich reward, and it's called spring. The temperatures rise, the snow melts away, and winter relaxes its icy grip, conceding the landscape to spring's warm touch. Green shoots of grass inch their way upward, testing the air, just to be sure it's really here, that spring has truly sprung, especially since that snowstorm, the second week of March, was such a disappointing setback. Birds that were absent for the past several weeks suddenly make an appearance and threaten to overpower all who have ears to hear with their triumphant singing. Wobbly-leg lambs and bawling calves fill barnyards, and new foals prance around pastures, showing off their miraculous ability to walk from birth. "I'd like to see a human do that," they seem to say as they high-step through new grass. Yes, spring is marvelous, and it's all the better after winter's lengthy reign. Aside from all the new life, there is one more thing you can always count on when things start to grow again, and that's the burn season. You see, at the end of summer, tall stalks of grass and weeds filled every pasture and sprung up in all the fields. But when the first good hard freeze hit, all of these withered and died. Now, after months under snow, they are brown and lifeless, and without a good burn, they will choke out the new life that wants to emerge. So, we burn. Controlled burns remove dead growth from the previous year and allow for the new grass and feed for animals to emerge. It's not uncommon in late April or early May to see clouds of smoke rising from ditches, fields, and pastures all around the Bighorn Basin. I remember a colleague who moved to Wyoming from back east complaining to me about it. "Why are all the farmers burning everything in sight?" she complained. "When the wind blows the smoke this way, it's unbearable." I smiled and said, "They're just burning off the stubble from last year. It won't last long." "Farmers back home never burned," she said. "Why do they do it here?" "Well," I mused, "it's probably because where you're from there's enough moisture in the ground and microbes that they can plow under the corn stalks and other dead stuff, and it'll decompose overnight. Here, you could plow under a cornfield and be digging up stalks 2 or 3 years later. The soil's just so dry you have to burn to get rid of last year's growth." She wasn't very satisfied with my answer, but the farmers didn't seem to pay much heed. They just went right on burning. Growing up on the ranch in Poverty Flats, we also burned from time to time, and one year in particular stands out in my memory. It was just after school had ended, and it was a Saturday, so Dad had the day off work. We were still living in the trailer house, and it had been a long winter, the kind that lasted long enough that subspecies of vertebrates could have had time to evolve and go extinct before it ended. But now the last remnants of snow had faded away like a bad memory, and temperatures were beginning to climb. The morning dawned clear and bright, and the sky was azure above the majestic Bighorn Mountains in the east. Even though it was a Saturday, Dad was up with the sun, as per usual, and being freed from the bonds of winter and school, Fred and I were eager to be out and about with him. First, Dad filled a backpack sprayer with water. Are we going to spray weeds? We wondered. Then he grabbed a rake. With the sprayer on his back and the rake in hand, he walked back to the house. "What do you do with a backpack sprayer and a rake?" I hissed to Fred as we crunched across the gravel driveway. "No idea," Fred shrugged. Dad's boots clicked hollowly as he walked across the boards of the low wooden porch. Reaching the door, he set the sprayer and the rake down. He pulled the sliding glass door to the side, and we followed him into the house. Dad went into the kitchen and reached up to the shelf above the fireplace, where he grabbed a small box. "Dad, what are those for?" Fred finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "Oh, these?" Dad asked, raising the box of matches. "We're going to burn all that dead grass between Grandma and Grandpa's place and Aunt Janet's house." "The girls and I will be out soon," Mom said, coming down the hallway with little Annie in tow. "Can Fred and I light the fire?" I asked, my voice rising with excitement. A grin flitted across Dad's face. "Maybe," he said. "Oh boy, a fire!" Fred shouted, looking like it had just been announced that Christmas was coming early. "It won't be anything huge," Dad said in an attempt to calm us. "We're just burning a few dead weeds." Mom chimed in. "You just be careful. Remember when the Lymans burned down the river bottom a few years ago? People are still talking about that." "We're a couple miles from the river, dear," Dad said. "Like I said, we're just going to burn a few weeds." The air was still, and the morning was cool as we trekked down the dirt road towards Grandma Jones's house. Meadowlarks sang in the trees, and sheep bleated in the distance. The anticipation of spring and the impending arrival of green grass and warm days hung around us, and Fred and I eagerly kept pace with Dad's longer strides. He easily shouldered the backpack sprayer and had distributed rakes and shovels to the two of us, just in case. We had never burned weeds with Dad before, and I couldn't wait to start an actual fire in the middle of a pasture. At the advanced age of 8 years old, Dad had let me strike a match to light the fire in the big wood stove in the trailer house, and I thought I was getting pretty good at it. In fact, I thought I was pretty good at handling fire in general, and was sure my skills would come in handy today. When we finally reached the pasture, we hopped the ditch, which still wasn't running any water, and headed across the wide open stretch of farmland. There may be a bit of a breeze coming out of the east, Dad mused, pausing to lick a finger and hold it up. Let's start on the east side. Dead grass brushed our waists as we threaded through the patches on our way to the edge of the pasture. I'm not sure quite what I imagined. Maybe I thought the fire would just burn where we wanted it to. I knew it could spread if we weren't careful, but we had our shovels and the rake, and Dad had an entire backpack sprayer full of water. Frankly, I couldn't see any way things could get out of hand. Here we go, Dad grunted as we reached the woven wire fence on the edge of the pasture. We'll start it here and burn toward the road. Can I strike the match, Dad? Can I? Fred asked. What about me? I blurted out. I want to strike a match. Guys, Dad said, holding up his hands to placate us. You can both give it a shot. All right, let's go, we chorused. Al, you can go first, Fred said. That's very nice of you, Fred, Dad said approvingly. Okay, thanks, Fred, I said, reaching for the box of matches. Here, Dad said, handing me a single match. You want to get low and light the edge of one of these big grass patches. Okay, I said, and accepted the box. I crouched down and Dad dropped to one knee beside me. Hands shaking with excitement, I touched the little white dot on the top of the red match head to the textured side of the box and dragged it across the surface with a quick zip. Immediately, yellow flame erupted on the end of the little matchstick, and I dropped it quickly at the base of the tall, dry grass stalks. To my dismay, the little flame coughed, sputtered, and went out, a little wisp of black smoke rising from the once bright matchstick. Shoot, I snapped, screwing up my face in displeasure. It went out. You need to hold it a little longer, Dad instructed. Let it start burning the grass before you drop it. Can I try? Fred chimed in. Let me have another chance, I begged. Let's let Al give it one more try, Dad said. I quickly slid the box open and selected another match. Closing the box, I struck my second one. This time, instead of tossing it on the ground, I held the little flame to the base of the grass and watched as the fire licked eagerly at the bone-dry stalks of dead vegetation. Suddenly, the grass burst into flame, and the fire jumped from stalk to stalk, devouring the parched grass. It's working, I shouted. Good job, Dad said approvingly. Now it's my turn, Fred said. Yeah, you can start one right over here, Dad said, pointing off to another stand of dead grass. Fred eagerly accepted the box of matches from me and took a few steps in the direction Dad was pointing. Meanwhile, my little fire was marching steadily along, the flames and smoke rising straight upward. Before long, Fred had his patch of grass burning, and the twin fires steadily grew, spreading out from their starting points to consume more and more of the dry grass. Soon the two fires met and began advancing forward, burning everything in their path and leaving black, smoldering piles of ash in their wake. The sound of crackling flames filled the air, and Fred and I looked on with barely contained excitement. Burning weeds is way better than starting a fire in the stove, I shouted. Dad laughed. You think so? The fire wasn't just moving away from us, it was also moving back toward us and the fence behind us. When it gets close to the fence, we have to put it out, Dad said. He demonstrated his point by smacking a little flame near a fence post with his shovel, beating it down with the back of the spade. The little flame was extinguished in an instant, and nothing but a tendril of smoke rose from where it had been eagerly devouring dry grass just seconds before. Just then, a group of 3 figures appeared through the smoke, and I recognized them as none other than the Trio of Trouble, a nickname I had assigned to my 3 older sisters, and an apt one at that. As per usual, my oldest sister Candace was in the lead. Each one of the girls was armed with a rake or a shovel, and Alice, the youngest of the 3, was doing her best to keep up with Beatrice and Candace, but they had a pretty good lead on her. Candace and Beatrice had to skirt the flames to reach Dad, Fred, and I, and when she arrived, she was breathless as a summer day. "Hey, Dad," she panted. "This sure makes a lot of smoke." Dad nodded and continued watching the flames, which had left a ribbon of charred stubble that stretched nearly from one edge of the pasture to the other. The distinct odor of burning weeds filled the air, and waves of heat rose from the flames, causing the air to shimmer. Alice arrived and let her rake fall to the ground with a thud. "Why do we need these?" Alice asked. "I thought we were burning the weeds, not digging them up." "They're to help us make sure the fire goes where we want it to," Dad said. "Look, the fire's getting close to the edge of the pasture here. Help me put it out before it reaches this fence." Fred and I jumped into action, swatting at the flames and stopping them before they had a chance to cross the fence. Pretty soon all the Jones kids were spread out, whacking the ground with a variety of garden implements. "Candace, you watch that edge with Beatrice and Alice," Dad instructed. "Fred, Al, you come with me." The girls moved north as the fire continued traveling down the fence line, and Dad, Fred, and I followed its progress southward. Every time it neared the fence, we were quick to stamp it out. Since the weeds weren't very tall or thick, the fire never seemed to get too hot or too large to handle, and we found we could even walk on the ground where it had just been burning without doing any harm to the black rubber irrigating boots Fred and I always wore. "Dad, what would happen if the fire crossed the fence?" I asked. "That wouldn't be good," Dad said. "We'll have a hard time stopping it if it gets into the next pasture." He paused to beat out a tongue of flame that had erupted next to the fence. Every now and then he would pump the backpack sprayer and squirt some water on a spot that was still smoking after he had hit it with the shovel a few times. "We wouldn't want it to reignite," Dad explained. To the west, the first of the flames had reached the ditch and the road. "Dad, the fire is going out when it reaches the road," Fred shouted. "That's the idea," Dad grunted, intent on his work. "Candace, how's it going down there?" he shouted over to the girls. "Good," came the reply. "When it reaches Aunt Janet's fence, put it out," Dad called. "Okay," Candace shouted back. We had reached the corner of the pasture, and Fred and I were beating out flames left and right. It was a fiery game of whack-a-mole, and we were thoroughly enjoying ourselves. In what seemed like no time at all, the pasture on the east side of the dirt road was a solid field of smoldering black ash, and the flames had been extinguished. We all stood surveying our work, and Dad said, "Let's go ahead and start the west side of the pasture." It sounded like a good idea to us, and even though we were upset when Dad let the trio start this fire, we were more than happy to keep on burning. Fred and I were a couple of budding pyromaniacs now, and we couldn't wait to see the pasture burn. About the time the second pasture had really started to take off, the wind picked up. It had been a perfectly calm morning up till then, but as Dad would later say, if you want a calm day to turn into a windy one, just light something on fire. The first sign of trouble came when the fire was approaching the stock pond on the south side of the pasture. A gust of wind came up from behind us, and as we watched, the flames swelled and began rolling across the ground at a rapid pace. Where the fire in the first pasture had been well behaved, nibbling its way through the grass, this second one suddenly flew into a feeding frenzy. "Dad!" Candace screamed. "It's getting close to the pond!" "It's headed for Grandpa's shop over here," Dad shouted. Another gust of wind whipped across the pasture, and before we knew it, a roar like a pride of lions split the air. The pond was on fire. Sheets of flame shot skyward as last summer's cattails caught fire, followed closely by cottonwoods and the Russian olives that surrounded the pond. A column of smoke rose heavenward. "Son of a gun!" Dad shouted. "Dang Wyoming wind! It was a totally still day." "Dad, the pond's on fire!" I shouted. I'm sure it took all of Dad's willpower not to say something sarcastic in response to my stating the obvious, especially under the stressful circumstances. "We can't do anything about it," he said through gritted teeth. "You two, go make sure it doesn't burn down the fence on the other side of the pasture or jump the county road," Dad instructed between furious thwacks of his shovel. Fred and I scurried across the scorched earth and chased the flames as they advanced toward the other side of the pasture. Just as we were nearing the county road, a four-wheeler roared up, spitting gravel as it went. When it reached the stack yard in front of us with its towering rows of stacked hay bales, the driver, a man I had never seen before, wearing a ball cap and irrigating boots, leapt from its seat and began shoveling dirt like a madman. Fred and I joined him, too intent on our work and breathless to have time for introductions. After several minutes of furious effort, we extinguished all the fire near the stackyard and finally paused to survey the rest of the pasture. Mom had arrived on our own four-wheeler, and she was buzzing around using the weed sprayer mounted on the back of the ATV to extinguish flames. Candace, Beatrice, and Alice were working near her on the north of the pasture, and Dad was managing the south side, where the flames threatened Grandpa's shop. The pond was still blazing away, and we were helpless to do anything about it. "Hi, I'm Larry," the man in the ball cap said. "Looks like this one got away from you," he observed. "Yeah, just a bit," Fred said, trying not to sound like he had just emerged from a full-on panic. "I saw the smoke, and then I noticed the fire getting close to the stackyard, so I thought I'd give you guys a hand," Larry said. "Well, thanks for your help," I replied. "We better go help my dad over there. If the shop burns down, we'll be in real trouble." Fred and I raced across the burnt field to where Dad was beating out flames. Fire had reached the fence near the county road, and in the first bit of good luck we'd had in the past hour, it was sputtering out when it reached the bare road rather than jumping it, as Dad had worried it might do. When we reached Dad, he had just about finished putting out the east side of the pasture. "That guy came and helped us put the fire out by the stackyard," Fred said. "Good," Dad panted. "Uncle Greg would not have been happy if his hay went up in smoke." We beat out the last of the flames and watched as the fire reached Grandma's lane and started going out on its own. On the other side of the pasture, a Chevy Suburban came to a stop on the county road, and a posse of boys piled out, followed by none other than Mrs. Flincherton. "Did the whole town show up?" Dad asked. "All this is a little weed fire," he groaned. I looked over to where the last of the trees around the pond were ablaze and shrugged. "At least we didn't set the river on fire like the Lymans did," Fred observed. Dad sighed. "I guess this one got a little out of hand, huh?" "Maybe a little," I agreed. That was the last time we burned the pasture between Aunt Janet's house and Grandma and Grandpa Jones's place. There were other controlled burns, but they all paled in comparison. Every time we'd burn a little pile of weeds or a ditch bank, Fred and I would say to each other, "You remember that one time a fire got away from us and burnt the pond? Now that was a fire." Well, there you go. Another untold tale from this side of nowhere. I miss those days, burning fields and having spring come out in Poverty Flats. Things were a lot more simple as a kid, and I think that we probably stressed less about the fire than my parents did, you know? being an adult comes with its own set of worries. I'm sure you have never had a fire get out of hand, but if you have, then I'd love to hear about it. You're welcome to shoot me an email at untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com or comment on this story when it comes out on Facebook, and we'll be sure to mention your comment on the next episode. As always, if you could, go ahead and give us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. Don't be afraid to subscribe, and I look forward to catching you next time on Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much and still find time for the important things, like fishing. See you next time, folks.